Welcome to the Utopian Space. Willkommen im utopischen Raum. Ich darf Sie auf das Allerherzlichste im Namen der Alten Schmiede, aber nicht nur im Namen der Alten Schmiede, sondern auch im Namen aller unserer Kooperationspartner, die ich dann auch noch einige erwähnen werde, hier zur Eröffnung der diesjährigen Literatur im Herbst begrüßen. I heartfully welcome all our participants who contribute to this 2.5 days program. Die kommen in diesem Jahr, wenn ich richtig gezählt habe, es sind insgesamt 22, aus 7 Ländern. Das große Paradox unserer Epoche ist, wir wagen es nicht mehr, uns die Zukunft vorzustellen, schreibt Marc Auger, den ich hier auch begrüßen darf. Welcome in Vienna. Bonjour. In seinem Manifest Die Zukunft der Erdbewohner, und da werden Sie dann von ihm mehr hören, am Sonntag um 18 Uhr. Wir von der Alten Schmiede haben uns in diesem, man bezeichnet das immer als Format, ein komischer Ausdruck für Veranstaltung oder für mehrtägige Veranstaltung, die letzten Jahre schon länger mit der Zukunft und mit den Utopien hier in diesem schönen Raum beschäftigt. Das hat begonnen vor 2 Jahren mit Dialektik der Befreiung. Damals hat den Eröffnungsvortrag Milo Rau gehalten und der Titel dieses Vortrags war Die Rückeroberung der Zukunft. Im Vorjahr haben wir uns hier beschäftigt mit Dystopien und Utopien, nicht nur literarisch, und erstmals auch schon, das war bei der Dialektik der Befreiung so, und auch im Vorjahr unter Kuratoren, Mitkuratorenschaft im Team wesentlich auch beitragend mit Ilija Trojanow, in 2, 3 Debattensträngen erstmals den Begriff hier verwendet, der utopische Raum. In diesem Jahr sind nicht nur 2 oder 3 Debattenstränge, sondern das gesamte Format heißt der utopische Raum. Und das heißt deshalb der utopische Raum, weil wir über jetzt 3 Literatur im Herbst hier einen Raum öffnen möchten, von Wien heraus, über Wien hinaus. Wie sich das weiterentwickeln wird, werden Sie auch in der Folge hören. Ich darf auf das Allerherzlichste begrüßen und freue mich, dass sie wieder bei uns ist, die amtsführende Stadträtin für Kultur und Wissenschaft, Veronica Kaup-Hasler, und darf dich jetzt um deine Worte bitten.
Ja, herzlichen Dank. Herzlich willkommen. Ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie alle diesen utopischen Raum betreten möchten. Und ich möchte Sie begrüßen zu einer Veranstaltung, die mit einer gewissen Anmaßung sozusagen sagt, wir wollen entlang denken an einem Gedankenkonstrukt, die der utopische Raum ist. Wir wollen uns damit beschäftigen. Vorab würde ich gerne darüber reflektieren, es gibt natürlich unglaublich viel Dystopisches um uns herum. Teilweise gelebte Dystopien, teilweise, wenn man sich anschaut, was im Mainstream, aber auch in der Mainstream-Literatur sehr oft vorkommt, Hungerkämpfe, Entwürfe von einer Zukunft, die sich nur als martialisch verstehen kann, die von Gewalt, Ausgrenzung, von einem klaren Kastenwesen getrieben ist, von Robotern, also Angstbildern, die uns umgeben. Zukunft wird sehr oft einfach in Negation, in Angst gedacht. Man kann aber auch etwas Positives daraus ziehen, dass sie sind natürlich auch immer Visionen und Gedanken, die auch eine Vorwarnung sein mögen oder als Vorwarnung verstanden werden können oder pervertierte, ins Übermaß verzerrte Entwürfe von Gesellschaft, wie sie teilweise schon in unterschiedlichen Regionen, Ländern auch gelebt wird. Wenn wir über die Geschichte der Utopien nachdenken, von Platons Politeia über Thomas Moros, über so viele andere, sind es immer Entwürfe, die eigentlich in die Zukunft gerichtet sind und immer ein Gedankenmodell von Gesellschaft darstellen, aber immer auch einen ganz großen negativen, problematischen Gehalt haben. Wenn ich jetzt Ilja Trojanow und dich richtig verstehe, geht es hier aber um einen Versuch, diese Zukunft einmal in einem kurzen Moment, kurzem Aufflackern des Positiven zu skizzieren, weil wir alle wissen, wir kennen das ist auch schon zum Überdruss genannt worden, immer wieder, uns gehen die Utopien aus, uns gehen die Visionen für Gesellschaft aus. Ich glaube, dem ist nicht so. Vielleicht auch, weil ich aus der Kunst komme und vielleicht auch, weil ich immer wieder kleine Zellen und utopische Räume entdecken kann, die, und das gilt es vielleicht in den nächsten Tagen zu besprechen, durchaus miteinander verwoben sind. Und wir haben etwas zu erkämpfen, wir haben eine Kraft zu erkämpfen, eine Vision, eine Gesellschaft, wie sie friedlich, ohne durch neoliberale Kräfte und durch den Kapitalismus unserer Zeit völlig zerrissen zu werden, wie hier Gemeinschaft entstehen kann. Wie wir es schaffen könnten, dass der Mensch im Mittelpunkt bleibt, dass wir an einem neuen Verständnis von solidarischem Handeln, Teilen, Teilhabe entlang denken. Und das ist, glaube ich, die große Potentialität und diese Lust, die wir dabei vielleicht entwickeln können, nicht nur in der Negation, nicht nur im Fatalismus, hinter dem sich jeder verstecken kann, zu verharren, sondern auch mutig und mit einer gewissen Sicherheit, dass man nicht alleine in diesem Feld agiert, denn es gibt so viele, die das brauchen, die eine Sehnsucht haben nach diesen anderen Räumen, diesem anderen Denken von Gesellschaft. Wir sind viele. Im Grunde, glaube ich, sind wir viele. Wir müssen uns anders vernetzen, sichtbar machen, lautbar machen und weiter nicht nur träumen, sondern auch ganz konkrete Handlungen setzen. Es kann nicht dabei bleiben, dass wir das nur im diskursiven Raum klären, sondern ich glaube, das, was Utopien auch ganz stark machen könnte, wäre, dass wir dieses ferne Licht, diesen Utopus, diesen nicht erreichten Raum einfach sukzessive uns dem annähern durch konkretes Tun, jeder an seinem Platz. Ich gerade mit meinem wunderbaren Ausflug in die Politik, andere an ihren Orten. Das kann man, egal wo man ist, kann man das leben. Und daher freue ich mich sehr, dass Sie alle zusammengekommen sind, um dieses Thema sozusagen gemeinsam auch die nächsten Tage zu besprechen, und wünsche euch allen viel Glück bei diesem guten, wunderschön anmaßenden Unterfangen.
Vielen Dank, Veronica. Im Vorjahr, du warst da, war da ja der Eröffnungsvortrag der Hoffnung und der Angst um die Kunst gewidmet von Dietmar Dart. Ich habe aus deiner Rede ein bisschen herausgehört, nicht nur den Wunsch und den Auftrag nach Reflexion, sondern auch nach Aktion. Wir werden schauen, also unsere Schule ist ja immer die, dass wir uns zuerst theoretisch vergewissern und wenn es dann theoretisch so weit festgelegt ist im Koordinatensystem, dass wir dann zu den Aktionen immer wieder schreiten. Da du uns ja schon länger beobachtest, weißt du, dass wir auch durchaus aktivistische Kräfte entwickeln können und werden. Vielen Dank noch einmal. Ich darf noch ein paar Anwesende vorstellen, bevor ich überleite zur Eröffnungsrede von Mary Kaldor. Ich freue mich, dass unser Vorstandsmitglied Rudolf Burger da ist, dass Wolfgang Petritsch gekommen ist, der, wenn ich mich recht erinnere, auch schon einmal bei einer Literatur im Herbst mitdiskutiert hat, damals Jugoslavia Revisited 2012. Ich begrüße die Botschafterin der Republik Slowenien und natürlich auch unsere Kooperationspartner. Von ATTAC sehe ich Alexandra Strickner, die am Sonntag, glaube ich, auftreten wird, und natürlich eine Hauptvertreterin, eine Hauptkooperationspartnerin, aber wir kommen dann noch auf dich zurück, Shalini, Randeria, die Rektorin des IWMs. Ohne Utopien droht uns die Hoffnungslosigkeit, und diese ist die vorweggenommene Niederlage, schreibt Elia Trojanow, Karl Jaspers zitierend, in seiner essayistischen Annäherung an die Zukunft in dem Essay Alle Wege führen durch Utopia. Und diesen Essay können Sie in der hier aufliegenden Hammerzeitung, eine Empfehlung zur Lektüre, nachlesen. Wir haben als Team gemeinsam, ich und Elia Trojanow, das diesjährige Programm zusammengestellt, und ich freue mich ganz besonders, dass ich Ihnen jetzt die Eröffnungsrednerin Mary Kaldor vorstellen darf. Welcome in Vienna. Just give me 2 minutes because I would like to put some sentences on you in German. Mary Kaldor ist eine Autorin und eine Wissenschaftlerin. Sie ist auch eine Aktivistin. Sie ist Professorin für Global Governance an der London School of Economics and Political Science und Leiterin dort des Center for the Study of Global Governance. Sie ist Vorstandsmitglied des Stockholm International Peace Research Institutes, und ihre Schwerpunkte in ihrer Arbeit sind Globalisierung und internationale Beziehungen, globale Zivilgesellschaft und Global Governance. Sie ist Herausgeberin des European Nuclear Disarmament Journals. Sie war immer auch eine Aktivistin in der Anti-Atom-Bewegung, in der Antimilitarisierungsbewegung. Sie ist eine Grassroot-Aktivistin. Es gibt viele Veröffentlichungen von ihr und Sie finden auch einiges am Büchertisch. Ich verweise nur auf Unsere beste Waffe ist keine Waffe, Konfliktlösungen für das 21. Jahrhundert. European Utopias from Below ist der Titel der Eröffnungsrede. Der Ablauf wird so sein, dass diese Rede eben auf Englisch, die ungefähr, glaube ich, 20 bis 25 Minuten dauern wird, von Mary Kaldor jetzt gehalten wird. Und dann wird sie im Gespräch sein mit Shalini Randeria. Und dieses Gespräch möchten wir dann öffnen, so wie wir das die ganzen 3 Tage halten möchten, dann zum Publikum. May I kindly ask you to take over the floor, Mary? Thank you.
Notes here. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for the nice introduction, even though, unfortunately, I don't speak German, so I wasn't able to understand it, although I could catch some words. And likewise, I hope I don't repeat what's been said before. Again, I got a glimpse of neoliberalism, visions, activism. So what I wanted to talk about today was to go back to the 1989 revolutions. It's 30 years since the 1989 revolutions. And what struck me at the time and still strikes me about the commentary on those revolutions was the immediate reaction was there was nothing new about those revolutions. Jürgen Habermas wrote, "A peculiar characteristic of this revolution, namely its total lack of ideas that are either new or oriented towards the future." And I remember at the time he called them Nachholende revolutions, rectifying, returning. And I remember being very surprised at the time because I had been intensely involved in the dialogue between East and West that led up to the 89 revolutions. And for me, it was a moment of great intellectual ferment. I felt this was the moment that really influenced my entire intellectual formation. So how could it be that most commentators, even today, still think there was nothing new about the 1989 revolutions? And my answer really is that I think it has something to do with what the late Ulrich Beck called methodological nationalism. People are looking in the wrong place. They're looking at the national level, whereas the really profound implications were at European and global level. And that's why I've called it a European utopia from below. I think there was a new vision that came out of the dialogue between the West European peace movement and the East European human rights movements. That was to be terribly important. It wasn't the first European utopia from below, and I will, after I've described what happened in 1989, I'll say a few words about past utopias, and nor was it the last. I think we're in the midst of trying to construct another. And so I will end with a few words about that. But my focus is telling again this story, which has, I think, been left out of accounts of the 1989 revolutions. Just before I start, maybe a word about utopias. I was sort of pondering this rather intriguing title, Utopian Space, Utopian Room. At one point it was concrete utopias. And utopia literally means nowhere, but space or room means somewhere. So how do we reconcile this? I was quite influenced by Immanuel Wallenstein uses the word utopistics to get away from the illusory nature of utopias. Utopias by their nature are illusory, and political utopias have often led to dangerous social engineering. But on the other hand, the sort of usual conservative argument that we must be pragmatic, that it's dangerous to have illusions, that everything should stay the same, is also very dangerous, particularly in moments like this, which I think are great moments of historical transition. So what Wallenstein says is what he means by utopistic is a sort of plausible historical alternative that's based on reasoned argument and judgment. And what I want to argue is that such plausible alternatives come out of collective debate and deliberation. These plausible historical alternatives are the collective knowledge that comes out of social struggles. Their originality, I think, emerges from deep and bitter arguments, which is really the stuff of what happens in these campaigns. And I think their plausibility comes from the scale of popular engagement. So what I'm trying to, I think moments of political ferment, moments of debate and deliberation produce this kind of collective knowledge. And it's based on the contribution of numerous individuals and the exchanges between them, so it's not just holistic. And I just want to tell the story of what happened before '89, because I think it did produce a set of collective ideas. And this is the spirit in which I want to talk about the 1989 revolutions. Those of us of my generation will remember that the 1980s was a period of mass mobilization. In 1979, President Reagan announced the deployment of a new generation of intermediate-range missiles, the cruise and Pershing missiles, that was supposed to be more usable than ever before, more usable because that, they felt, would convince the Soviet Union that they were serious about deterrence. But the result was a mass peace movement, and millions demonstrated across Europe in 1981 and in 1983, and there were peace camps at all the sites where the intermediate missiles were going to be deployed. Many of you will have heard of Greenham Common, the women's peace camp. A couple of weeks ago with Shalini, I was in Sicily, and there was also a women's peace camp there at Comiso. So this was the period of what my late colleague Fred Halliday called the Second Cold War. We'd been through a period of détente, we'd had the Helsinki Agreement, and now we had the return of hostile rhetoric, the return of displays of military might. And just as there were new movements in Western Europe, there were also new movements in Eastern Europe that probably came directly out of the Helsinki Agreement. For those who don't remember, the Helsinki Agreement was signed in 1975 because the Americans wanted a new détente after they'd withdrawn from Vietnam. And in that agreement, the East European countries, the Soviet Union, all the communist countries signed what they thought were paper commitments to human rights in exchange for a Western commitment to the territorial status quo and to economic and social cooperation. But actually that agreement did produce new movements. It produced Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. It produced CORE in Poland, the Workers' Defense Committee, and later a mass trades union, Solidarity. It produced the democratic opposition in Hungary. And even in the GDR, what we saw was actually a mass peace movement. It's not often written about, called Swords and Plowshares, that was under the umbrella of the East German churches. Now, I belong to a bit of the peace movement. I did recognize that in the introductory speech, European nuclear disarmament. And we saw ourselves not just as an anti-nuclear movement, but an anti-Cold War movement. We wanted to end the Cold War, and we made a deliberate link between ending the arms race and bringing about democracy in Eastern Europe. And we saw the Cold War as a kind of virtual conflict, an imaginary war, in which the endless exercises across the East German plains, the spy stories, the new rounds of armaments were a kind of disciplinary technology, a mutual enterprise in which both the Soviet Union and the United States maintained their spheres of influence. And it was quite effective, because if you protested for peace, you were seen as a fifth column of the Soviet Union. And if you were for human rights in Eastern Europe, you were seen as an agent of Western imperialism. And the questions that we asked ourselves on both sides both had to do with democracy and peace, with democracy and disarmament, with peace and human rights. We asked ourselves as nuclear activists, how can we be democratic when control over life and death is not only in the hands of our own politicians, that's bad enough, but in the hands of Washington or NATO? What does it mean to be democratic when those politicians can choose to destroy the world without asking our permission? And there, I had a lovely quote, the trouble is with my, actually from George Conrad, who, the Hungarian novelist who, alas, just recently died. He said, "The Soviet and American presidents have more power than all the tyrants of history combined. I look at those two faces and blanch. I wouldn't entrust the fate of humanity to even Aristotle or Kant." So what we stressed really was the importance not so much of capturing power, but of changing the relations between state and society. What happened during the 80s was that peace activists traveled to East Europe to make contact with East European activists, and there we discovered a whole new language. Those dissidents in Eastern Europe were very intellectual. They spent a lot of their time reading Aristotle and Plato, and all sorts of terms they began to use which seemed to us to be very relevant to our own situation. People don't realize now that the word civil society was hardly used before 1989. It was actually just a few Italian communists who got it from Gramsci. Otherwise, nobody else used the term. But it was rediscovered in Eastern Europe. Particularly important was the Polish intellectual Adam Michnik, who wrote this very important article in 1987 called The New Evolutionism. And in that article, he said, look, we've learned that the attempt to overthrow regimes never works. Revolutions fail because they're always stronger than us. So what we must do is to try to change the relationship between state and society. We have to try to build a civil society, by which he meant autonomous spaces like an independent trades union or an independent university. And very similar terms were used by Václav Havel, the Czech playwright who became president, or George Conrad, anti-politics, the parallel polis, where we try to live as an Aristotelian good life, living in truth, as Havel put it, refusing the lies of the totalitarian regime. I think what's interesting to me is that they were very conscious that this was a global issue and not a purely East European issue. Conrad was actually the first, I think, to use the term globalization in his book Anti-Politics, which was published in English in 1982. So it was long before other people were using the term. He talked about nuclear war as global Auschwitz. Havel talked about resisting the automatism of the global technological civilization, and he said it applied to the West as well as the East. We're just less aware of it because Western societies contain all sorts of subtle forms of manipulation. Now, the dialogue was not easy. Oh, there's one thing I really wanted to say, but no, oh yes, it's now. The dialogue was not easy. And I think one of the things that people probably don't realize now is the words peace and human rights were considered completely distinct words. Peace was something between states, and human rights was something you did inside states. And so Western talk of human rights was seen as dangerous interference. And the Soviet Union constantly talked about peace. So any talk of peace was viewed with great suspicion by people who opposed the Soviet Union. So there were huge arguments within the West European peace movement, within the human rights movements, and between us all. There were many people in the West European peace movement who thought peace comes before human rights. We have to engage with the establishment. Some were fellow travelers. Some still thought Eastern Europe represented socialism. Some felt if we could only make peace, human rights would follow. Some felt talk of human rights was used by Reagan and Thatcher as a justification for the arms race, and we were playing into those justifications. Equally, many in Eastern Europe thought Western military strength was the only way to bring about human rights, and they were deeply suspicious of people who used the term peace. Havel wrote a wonderful essay which was actually addressed to the European Nuclear Disarmament Convention of 1985 about the meaning of peace, which he called the anatomy of reticence, and why it was so difficult for East Europeans to engage in the dialogue. But actually, towards the end of the 1980s, as the dialogue became more and more intense, more trust grew between all sides. Peace activists were arrested, they were deported, and they helped to create space for new groups. There was a whole new generation of movements in Eastern Europe, which included peace and human rights in the GDR, freedom and peace in Poland, the Independent Peace Association and the John Lennon Society in Czechoslovakia, where they sang John Lennon songs on Charles Bridge, the Young Democrats in Hungary, and all of these groups came out of the dialogue with the Western peace movement. But I think more importantly, a sort of consensus was developing that actually you would never get democracy without détente, that détente and the end of the arms race would produce the conditions for opening up in Eastern Europe. That was the growing argument of the East Europeans, and by the same token, Western peace movements began to realize that democracy in Eastern Europe would be the way to end the arms race. And a very symbolic moment was the 1987 European Nuclear Disarmament Convention in Lund in Sweden, where Jacek Kuron of Solidarity, of the Polish intellectual, embraced E.P. Thompson, who was the big figure of END, as a sort of symbolic coming together of peace and human rights. And the same year, the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, was signed, very much, and I could go into it, but I won't, a consequence of peace movement pressure. And that opened up the possibility of détente, which made it much more difficult to crack down on the protests that happened. So what I really am trying to say is that what came out of all this, I think, was not so much to do with how you organized capitalism in Eastern Europe or democracy, but it was a new global discourse. There was a new Europeanism, the idea of Europe as a peace project, the link with human rights, the emphasis on transnational civil society, the emphasis on rights-based law, and what we saw is what's become known as the liberal peace, the growth of multilateral operations, and a whole new way of doing international relations, which was very different from the geopolitics of the Cold War. I mean, of course, the Cold War had come to an end, but these ideas that came to be expressed in the new discourse of the liberal peace very much were the ideas that came out of that dialogue. It was, if you like, a blurring of the inside and the outside. The inside being the world of politics and law. We tended to make a sharp distinction between power inside, which is based on politics, law, norms, legitimacy, and power outside, which is based on war and diplomacy. And it was as though the inside was moving outside. And that's very much, I think, expressed in European external policy. Now, before I go on to talk about what happened next, let me just say a few words about previous utopias. Actually, ever since the term Europe began to replace the term Christendom, we've seen European utopias from below, and very many philosophers and activists have come up with peace schemes for the whole of Europe. William Penn proposed a European Parliament. Most people are very familiar with the schemes of Abbé Saint-Pierre, which was written up by Rousseau, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and of course the most famous Immanuel Kant. I think what's less known is that from the mid-19th century onwards, there were actually mass peace congresses, rather like the END conventions. There were 11 between 1843 and 1889. I think 1843 was the first, and 33 between 1889 and 1939. In the 1849 Congress, Victor Hugo was the president, and he called for a United States of Europe. In the 1867 Congress, Garibaldi was appointed as honorary president, and this caused quite a controversy. I found this article in the LSE archives, where the peace activists were saying his only title to distinction are his warlike exploits. So they were very against him being part of the Peace Congress. But for me, probably what was the most important earlier utopia is the Ventotene Manifesto, which was drawn up by members of the resistance, anti-fascists, imprisoned by Mussolini on the island of Ventotene. Altiero Spinelli is the most well-known author, and it called for a united socialist Europe, and it was signed by members of the resistance across Europe, both East and West. And I do think it was very important in the thinking behind the European coal and steel community that eventually led to the European Union. And I think it is quite interesting to note that many of the peace activists of the 1980s were the children of members of the European resistance. So this is a little bit about the past, but of course, let us hope it was not the last. And as we all know, those great hopes of the 1990s, the liberal peace, all the things that we did in the Balkans, I'm very happy to see Wolfgang Petritsch here, were sidelined by the war on terror and the return of geopolitics over the last 2 decades. But also, we had hoped, those of us who were involved in the dialogue, that both NATO and the Warsaw Pact would be dissolved and that we would establish a new pan-European security system. We did establish the OSCE, but NATO continued to exist even though the Warsaw Pact, and to expand, even though the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. But I think even more importantly, both halves of Europe were overwhelmed by a wave of market fundamentalism. And what I ask myself is, why did we in the 80s neglect social justice? Why didn't we think about what would happen after '89 and argue with our friends about the importance of preserving certain social justice, greater equality, public services? Was it because we thought those battles were won, that we didn't need to bother? Was it because we were our friends in Eastern Europe were so anti-communist that we felt we shouldn't raise these issues? Another point that always strikes me is that if you look at the peaceful nature of the 1989 revolutions, when I look back at that, what I realize is that many of those communists, nomenclatura, looked at the West and thought, we can exchange our political positions for material wealth. And that's exactly what happened. They became the new oligarchs. Certainly, I think it's the case that the post-68 new, as they were called, the new social movements out of which the peace movement came, did think the social battles had been won and were much more worried about the overbearing nature of the state. We were worried about issues of gender, issues of the environment, peace and human rights. But I think what we didn't sufficiently appreciate was that at the same time what was emerging on the right was a similar distaste of the overbearing state, with the conclusion that what was needed was more free markets. Well, I think nowadays we're in the midst of a new struggle. I think those decades of neoliberalism produced inequality, a great deal of inequality. It produced crony capitalism. It's produced a pervasive distrust of institutions, and new movements of both right and left have emerged. I mean, we see new movements against untrammeled capitalism, social forums and Occupy, new parties like Syriza and Podemos. We see new climate change movements, although up till recently, these movements have been less concerned with the issues we were concerned with, less concerned with Europe, human rights, internationalism. I think this is beginning to change. I mean, I think I see it in my own country, obviously, because of Brexit. It has produced huge debates about whether you can have social justice or deal with climate change in one country, and what that means for the European Union, and how do we increase the accountability of the European Union. And I really hope that debate is going to produce the same kind of collective knowledge, a new kind of utopia from below. And I think this is a moment, a historical transition, a moment when we have to change if we're not going to face great dangers, whether it comes from the rise of right-wing populism, the dangers of a new wave of violence, whether it comes from the threats to the planet, unless we're able to develop some kind of new utopistic proposals. I wanted to end by reading to you something from E.P. Thompson, who was one of the big figures of END. History is always told from above, and the story I've told you is actually never told when the story of 1989 happens. And I think it's because history is told from above that we're often so bad at deciding what might happen in the future. When 1989 happened, all these people who had studied the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were just amazed that they hadn't been able to predict the 1989 revolutions. And indeed, one of the tropes of 1989 is that no one predicted it. They couldn't predict it because they didn't look at the movements. They looked at what was happening at state level. They studied May Day parades to see which person in the Politburo was on top. But I think those people who were involved in the dialogue were very sure that something was going to happen. And I wanted to read to you something from Edward Thompson, E.P. Thompson, that he said in 1982. He wrote a lecture called Beyond the Cold War. And that was a moment when we all thought the Cold War was here forever. He said, what we can glimpse now is a détente of peoples rather than states, a movement of peoples which sometimes dislodges states from their blocks and brings them into a new diplomacy of conciliation, which sometimes runs beneath state structures and which sometimes defies the ideological and security structures of particular states. The Cold War Roadshow, which each year enlarges, is now lurching towards its terminus. But in this moment, changes have arisen in our continent of scarcely more than 1 year's growth, which signify a challenge to the Cold War itself. These are not political changes in the usual sense. They cut through the flesh of politics down to the human bone. What I have proposed is improbable, but if it commenced, it might gather pace with astonishing speed. There would not be decades of detente as the glaciers slowly melt. There would be rapid and unpredictable changes. Nations would become unglued from their alliances. There would be sharp conflicts within nations. There would be successive risks. We could roll up the map of the Cold War and travel without maps for a while. Well, we've been traveling without maps, and I think ever since. And I think we need to be thinking about, not a map maybe, but a new vision, a new utopia from below. And what I'm very concerned with, I think the idea of a Green New Deal, a social green Europe is taking shape, but I'm really worried that we are neglecting these other issues. You know, if I compare how people reacted to Bosnia with how people react to Syria, there is no solidarity with the conflicts in our neighborhoods. You know, at the moment, we are seeing the most amazing protests in Lebanon and Iraq and in Sudan that are non-sectarian, non-secular, and yet hardly anyone writes about it. And I think what is going to be incredibly important is that we combine the lessons of 1989 with our new concerns. Thank you. Did I talk?
Thank you very much, Mary Kaldor. European Utopias from Below. You gave a big survey, I would say, not only from the 60s to now, but also looking back to the 19th century. I just would like to inform you, Mary, that 2 years ago we had a 3-day conference here, Dialectics of Liberation, which was to commemorate a conference in London, which was organized by Ronald D. Lang and Cooper. And because we tried to link back to these debates, because we think this is a big space somewhere between nowhere. And also I would like to thank you that you mentioned and remembered Dirk Conrad, our friend, who was here with us in a program some, if I remember correctly, some 12 years ago on poverty and richness. Ich darf Ihnen jetzt, sie ist schon auf der Bühne, die Rektorin, ich muss sie nicht allen vorstellen, aber ich möchte sie doch vorstellen. Kurz, Shalini Randeria. Bei uns im Programm steht sie hier als US-amerikanische Soziologin und Sozialanthropologin.
Inderin.
Ja, yeah, it's a mistake. I don't know where we took this. I hope not from your institute. Man könnte das genauso sagen, englische oder deutsche oder indische. Okay, sorry for this. Sie ist seit 2015, das habe ich schon gesagt, Rektorin am Institut für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen, die auch unsere wesentliche Partnerinstitution hier ist für diese Veranstaltungsreihe. Ihre Forschungsfelder sind Zivilgesellschaft, soziale Bewegungen und NGOs. Also das trifft sich auch mit Mary Kaldor. Anthropologie der Globalisierung, Rechtspluralismus und informelle Rechtsprechung sowie Postcolonial Studies mit Schwerpunkt Südasien. Sie hat viele Veröffentlichungen. Ich greife 2 raus: Border Crossings, Grenzverschiebungen und Grenzüberschreitungen in einer globalisierten Welt als Herausgeberin und gemeinsam mit Ludger Hagedorn, wenn Demokratien demokratisch untergehen. Bitte dich, das Gespräch zu übernehmen.
Vielen Dank. Mary, let me begin, Mary, by talking about one person whom you mentioned, and that is Spinelli. Spinelli's idea of a united socialist Europe as a utopia. But that's not the idea I'm going to pick up to begin with, but to say, in one of your articles recently on democracy and Brexit, you made a very interesting point using Spinelli, saying that actually the paradoxical thing about Brexit is that although it has unleashed so much of xenophobic nationalism, racism, all of the negative effects that we are seeing coming up, including the dismantling of democracy from within in Britain, what it also has opened up is a possibility. And the possibility, and you quoted Spinelli and said, the possibility of the substance of politics. And I think there is a utopian moment there to think about what kinds of substantive democratic visions have come up because of the disappointment with the workings, functionings of formal democracy. And that's something you've been looking at a lot in your project on subterranean politics, and that's what I would like to invite you to share with us to begin with.
Well, thank you. This is something I think a lot about, and I make this distinction that Shalini explained between formal and substantive democracy. Formal democracy refers to the procedures, elections, rule of law, freedom of assembly, but substantive democracy refers to the ability to participate in and influence the decisions that affect your life. And my feeling is that the current democratic crisis is really a crisis of substantive democracy. I often quote the Spanish indignados who say, we have a vote but not a voice. And this, I think Brexit is actually an expression of that democratic crisis. I mean, I've talked to many people in local areas, in leave areas, and there's a huge sense of political frustration. Yes, of course, they're left behind, they have been hit by austerity, but it's more the sense that people just don't listen to them. And Spinelli made this point about European politics. I mean, we often say European Union needs to democratize. I think it does need to democratize, but actually there are a lot of democratic mechanisms in the European Union. I mean, the Parliament does have the possibility to amend legislation, to make appointments. It actually has more power in some senses than national parliaments. We do have this nice initiative that came out of the Lisbon Treaty, the Citizens' Initiative, which is what stopped the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. But actually, people were just not engaged, and that's what Spinelli meant. Spinelli said it lacks political substance. People just weren't engaged in the European Parliament. European elections were always about national issues. No one much cared. There wasn't really a political process going on. And I think that's one of the reasons why people say the European Union is so bureaucratic. It's actually got quite a small civil service, about the size of a local council. But it seems bureaucratic because we don't see the politics. And the politics usually overshadows the bureaucracy in nation states. What happened with Brexit was that I think Brexit has shaken us, not only us, but I think people in Europe too, to start thinking about the politics. I mean, I find it completely extraordinary that there is now the most enthusiastic pro-European movement in Britain. I don't know if any of you saw the pictures of the anti-Brexit demonstrations, but there was London covered with EU flags. And there's a huge discussion that goes on in Britain about the need to reform the European Union, about the need to reform neoliberalism, the need to a Green New Deal, all of these, the need to increase democratic accountability, all of these are happening. But I think it's also happening across Europe as well, because what Brexit did was to provide a kind of shock. So now the right-wing populists don't actually want to leave the European Union. They just want to create a Europe of the nations. And as a consequence, I think, you're getting competing visions of Europe. And that was present at the European elections, not in Britain, alas, nor in Italy, but I think there really were competing visions. The PES manifesto was much more radical than in the past. It did call for a Green New Deal. Well, it called for a green transition.
Green transition.
And it called for Europe-wide unemployment insurance, for a Tobin tax, for a feminist Europe. So my feeling is that that's exactly what is happening. We are beginning to have a substantial discussion about the future of Europe, and that's what I hope will produce a new European utopia.
So to stay on this theme, maybe one could make a distinction between, you said at one point between right and left-wing movements, but one could say populist versus emancipatory movements.
Yes.
And I think if we use the term emancipatory movements, I think it may be worthwhile just staying with that for a while and thinking, so what kinds of revisioning, reimaginings of Europe, of another democracy, of a decent society are we getting that are coupled with a term that you used right at the beginning when you said we were thinking in terms of der utopische Raum, the utopian space, but we were also thinking in terms of concrete utopias. So you've been looking in your research at some of the experiments going on in Europe, which are concrete utopian experiments in very many different parts of Europe, which are really about different practices. And could you say something about that?
When we did the study of subterranean politics, interestingly enough, this was around 2011, 2012. What fascinated us was that there were lots of experiments. People were really trying to practice what they saw as democracy in the squares and so on. But they were very uninterested in the European issue. It just didn't come up, actually. When we interviewed people, nobody talked about Europe. And I always felt this was an incredible problem, because I didn't see how these experiments could become meaningful without a European framework. But the question is, how do you create a European framework while still allowing people to carry out these experiments
at a rather local level?
At a local level, and that's my big preoccupation. And the way I've tried to think about it and have discussed with people is that what we need to think about is to think about the European Union not as a new United States of Europe, like Victor Hugo proposed, but as a new layer of governance, a global layer of governance, whose job it is actually to protect local levels from the bads of globalization. You may have seen on Thursday that the Labour Party in Britain came out with the most radical manifesto
it ever has. Yeah.
And my immediate reaction was, you know, what will the financial markets do? And can actually one country do this kind of thing? And without protecting local experiments, whether it's financial markets, whether it's, you know, all the big business are saying, well, if you increase taxes on corporations, they'll all leave. So whether it's getting rid of multinational safe havens, or whether it's dealing with carbon emissions, actually, even if you have exciting ideas, it's extremely difficult to carry them out. So I would like to see the EU not as a state, but literally I would call it a model of global governance in which its revenue is raised from global sources, like a Tobin tax or a tax on multinationals or carbon emissions, in contrast to states who raise revenue on income. And that would, at the same time, that would be combined with a great degree of devolution and improved revenue raising at local levels, so that people really could influence decisions which affect their lives. It's another way of talking about subsidiarity, I guess.
So it is about thinking in terms of different scales than the national, because to come back to the point you were making, that someone like Habermas missed the point because he was so wedded to the national scale and the nation state. So we could go local on the one hand, and we could think of alternatives which are larger than the nation state, be they European or be they global, in terms of something like a Tobin tax. So that's one, is a question of scale. The other thing I thought, which is interesting in some of the work that you had done then, is to say part of these reimaginings and utopian visions are about processes and practices, and not so much about whether people are putting forward certain concrete demands or not. When the complaint was, what kind of a movement is this? They can't really be a progressive movement because they're not demanding a total revolution or a transformation of society. And one of the arguments I remember you making, saying, let's look at the process, because democracy lies in a different practice, and that in itself could be an enacted, embodied utopia.
Absolutely, that is what I think. And I think the interesting thing is, I mean, I mentioned in 1989 this really important point that we kept making over and over again, is that it's not about winning power. It's about changing the relations of state and society. And actually, I increasingly think the significance of winning power is not the policies that whoever comes into government carries out. It's the space they create for people to change society themselves. That's what I think, makes. And I'm very struck, I don't know whether, but I feel both during the Thatcher period and during the last 10 years of neoliberalism, we live in a very stressful society.
Which is true.
And, I think it's all those processes. We pay too much attention to winning power. And of course, we haven't talked about war and my other sort of work. But actually, this is what I feel about peace agreements too. Everyone is obsessed with reaching peace agreements. But it's actually the processes, the change in the social relations that constitute war that is important.
So let me ask you one question, and then we can open out for larger Q&A with our audience. And that is, one other aspect of these changes about practicing local democracy, which is, however, tied into a lot of transnational ideas, objective processes and movements. So without Tahrir Square, I don't think some of the Occupy could be understood. But one of the connections is through a different use of social media. So what has changed in a way, and I remember an article of yours where you say this is about the ethos of Web 2.0. This is a different use of the internet, which is not just the older kind of use, and it's the use of social media which transforms some of these practices.
Yes, what we said, and that was very much came out of the subterranean politics work, was the idea, when we said 2.0, what we meant is it's about editing and writing and not just reading. So it's about contributing, it's about being part of social media, and there's no doubt that in that sense the social media has brought about. And it's about being able to join a campaign and then come out and so on and so forth. So there's no question that social media has enormously speeded up mobilization. But there is something very strange, and I've been thinking about it. I mean, when I think about the 1980s, there was a mass movement. There were groups all over, everywhere. And we had these huge conventions with thousands of people.
Without any of this.
Without any of this.
This is what
we had none of this. And actually, if you look at the movements across Europe today, I think they're smaller and they're less interconnected. So I'm not sure.
This is what
when I think about it, I think there's no question that social media has an enormous impact on messaging. And I'm very worried about the games that are being played by Russia, by Israel, by the BJP in India on social media. So I've no doubt that all that, and you can do counter-messaging and everything, and we need to think of how to regulate it. But I am wondering how much it really has changed what being an activist means. It's a new tool, but...
Yeah. Well, let me, with that, open out for questions from the audience, and then I can come back to some of my other questions. It's just that I can't see very well from here. I'm totally blinded by the light, so I leave it to Walter Famler to orchestrate a little bit.
Yes, I try to orchestrate a little bit. Ich sehe auch sehr schlecht. Ist irgendjemand unter Ihnen, der wo? Okay, Holly Case has a question.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I thought it was really interesting. I'm wondering about the dynamic that you were just discussing now with globalization and the European level as being kind of a protector of local experiments against the winds of globalization. It seems as though like there's some kind of wish to create maybe a semi-permeable membrane that lets good forms of experimentations through, but not bad forms. So, I mean, you mentioned as a contrast, let's say, loopholes within globalization that allow for tax havens, for example. I'm just wondering if practically, if, you know, whether we assume that the globalization project is, you know, perpetually underway, whether we can actually filter good loopholes from bad loopholes in practical terms, or whether the existence of loopholes more generally is the problem, or the existence of certain kinds of loopholes within globalization. I'd just be curious to know, like, how one would finesse the closing of some and the keeping open of others.
Shall I answer? Mm-hmm. It's a very good question, and obviously it all depends on politics. But I suppose, I mean, I don't by any means, you know, how do we assume who's in power? You know, I don't think local is good and European is bad, or European is good and local is good and national is bad. It always depends on politics, whether you can close the loopholes or open the loopholes. But what I do think is that it does represent a new system of checks and balances. We've always thought in the nation state that we had checks and balances between the executive and the judiciary and the legislative. It works less well now, but I think the European Union or other multilateral organizations can provide a check upholding certain globally agreed standards. And equally, you can see how there can be local resistance or local... And if you ask, well, why should those standards be, quotes, good? I think that really depends on one's faith in deliberation, that if one assumes that there can be a deliberative agreement about what constitutes a standard, then by and large one would expect those standards to be in the global public interest. It's a big philosophical issue, really.
Gibt es noch jemanden, der Frage stellen möchte?
I can come back. In the meanwhile, während Sie nachdenken über was Sie fragen wollen, kann ich noch zwei Fragen stellen. So
maybe people would rather ask questions in German.
No, I don't think that is a problem, but if so, I can translate, or Walter can translate. This is not an issue. So I think, let me come back to two questions which occurred to me. So I think one of the questions you asked yourself in the talk was, why did we not think about social justice? I think one of the interesting things for me is the huge backlash against human rights at the moment. Human rights, which was so much part of the political discourse and the utopia that it would be possible to achieve justice by using human rights as an instrument, to do so both against the state as well as against any other oppressive agency. And it seems to me that human rights have suffered a rather sort of sad fate over the last few years, with a lot of deconstruction also from the left of a liberal conception of human rights. And the question is, do you think shifting the discourse even now to social and environmental justice is going to help us move in an emancipatory political direction?
Well, I don't without human rights. I mean, after all, look at China. I mean, not that China's doing that much on climate change, but certainly on social issues. I think we do need human rights. And I think that's why Europe's so important. I mean, we're surrounded by states that are deconstructing and rejecting human rights. And that's why it's so important that this European project survives. On this business, I think you're absolutely right that the left were involved in deconstructing human rights, and I hesitated about whether to call the discourse that came out of '89 the liberal peace, because the liberal peace has come under such critiques from the left. And I do think that the liberal peace, you know, whether we're talking about the Dayton Agreement or other projects, have had their problems, they've had their flaws, which we can be very critical about. But the left have taken the view that there's a line of left-wing thinking which says any kind of humanitarian intervention is simply great power using human rights as a pretense. And I think that really played into the war on terror rhetoric, and that suddenly all of that became blurred, and there's been this powerful anti-interventionist thinking, which has, I think, left us with this tragedy that's Syria. Syria tells us what happens when you don't have the liberal peace. So I think it's terribly important to reconstruct it, and it's terribly important that we keep hold of these issues. And interestingly enough, I think the debate that we're having in the UK about Brexit is very much linked to that, because there is on the left a strong group of what people call Lexiters.
Lexiters?
Yes, they're left exiters.
They're left exiters, okay.
And so they think that the European Union is unreformable, that neoliberalism is built into the Maastricht Treaty, and you have to go back to socialism in one country.
So it's a nationalist.
It's nationalist and a bit Stalinist too. So that's why I think it's so incredibly important to keep a hold of human rights and to push them. And I would define an emancipatory movement as one that has human rights, both political and civil and economic and social, at its heart.
At its heart. If there
we have another question. Johannes Kaup, bitte.
And Walter, then we have one here as well.
Good. Very clear. As we're living in a time where a new transgenerational issue is raised, like climate crisis, the climate emergency that we are seeing, it seems to have the power to unite the young generation, but also you have the Fridays for Future, you have the grandmas and granddads for future. So this is something, this is not only in the Western world, we see that for example, in Pakistan, which was very astonishing for me, in Asian countries, in Latin America now, it is popping up, and it's, of course, on the one hand, a movement that is driven by the fear for our environment, fear and everything. So, fear of the dystopian status that we are rushing in. But if you go on a deeper level, it is also a question, how can we live? Because we cannot deal with that problem with green technology or with some kind of political framework that is giving a solution to a problem, because it is linked to our lifestyle, it's linked to how we see each other, it's linked to how we build society, it's linked to how we envision globalization. Yeah? And so I think, to come back to the utopian place, it can give us some initiative to rethink who we are and what we want to be in present and for our future generations. It's not only a dystopian, it's also a utopian question below. And I would like to that you talk a little about that.
First of all, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts and your experience. There's a lot of things that resonated with me, in particular also what you said in relation to the need to not so much consider to seek power, but more to try to get the space to create the change that people need, or for people to do the change they need. But in relation to what I observe in Europe now, and you having been active in the peace movement, I'm interested to hear a bit what your observation is in relation to that. What I can see is, on the one hand, that the European level I would not so much perceive as one that is shielding the local level from globalization, but that the EU is one of the core drivers of this type of globalization. It's one of the most aggressive actors to push this model to create through international law, through trade agreements and investment policies, and layer above to basically make it more difficult for people to struggle for the things that they want. And at the same time, what we can see now is the re-emergence or the clear push to also go in the direction of militarization. So there is a decision to move towards a European army. There is the quest to spend a certain amount of the budget of the nation states, of the member states, on military expenditure, and it's clearly going also in the direction to sort of like defend the interests of the EU outside of the EU, whether it's access to resources or also to sort of like protect that people can come to Europe. So I wonder, you being a peace activist, what's your reflections on that? What do you say about that, and what is your perspective? Do we need a new peace movement in Europe?
Very interesting questions. First of all, on Utopia and the new generation. You know, the last book by Ulrich Beck was called Metamorphosis.
Yes.
And I can't remember whether this metaphor he used survived the book, but he said, which struck me very much, we're like caterpillars in a cocoon. And we just don't know where we're going, but we could turn into a beautiful butterfly. But the caterpillar doesn't know where it's going. And I do think there are real possibilities that if we were to start controlling carbon emissions, we were to start a green investment, I think it would take off, and we would find very profound changes in lifestyle and a new kind of mission, at least for the next few decades. On the other hand, what I'm afraid of is not just the threat of more disasters, storms, and all of these other things, but what I haven't talked about is, I'm really worried about the threat of violence in what I call a new war. New wars are typically the wars like Bosnia, Syria, and so on, but they involve a mixture of sort of hate crime sectarianism, and huge violations of human rights. And what so strikes me about these new right-wing leaders is that they represent a kind of license to behave badly. You know, I look at Boris Johnson, and he lies, he's horrible to women, he's horrible to Muslims, and there's a bit of the population that really likes that and thinks they can behave badly too. And it's what I fear is what I sometimes call a state unbuilding process, that we're reversing all the gains, and that's what you see in places like Syria, where law is broken down, where every norm is undermined, and a few people are hugely benefiting from it, but the rest are immensely suffering. And I'm not saying we're going to have a Syria, but I could see us gradually. And those kinds of conflicts are extremely difficult to end. Somebody yesterday said, when has a new war ended? The only one that ended was Bosnia, and it hasn't really ended. The peace agreement, the Dayton Agreement, entrenched the ethnic leaders and has left Bosnia as a sort of dysfunctional society. So, you know, that's my dystopia, actually. So that's one thing. And then I turn to your question. There's no question that the EU has done the opposite in the economic field, and the case of Greece was an extreme example of this. So I'm in agreement with you, but I think the EU can change, and I don't think it's true in all fields. I mean, the EU has taken the lead on climate change. I think, you know, and actually I think the external policy is nothing like as bad as you fear. I think there's a debate going along. Is this new defense capacity that Mogherini, I mean, if you read the global strategy, it's not about creating an army to defend us. It's about being able to do peacekeeping. It's about being able to have a slightly more political role. I mean, the European Union provides aid for reconstruction, but it is a political pygmy, for instance, in Syria. Just at this moment, it would be great, and the Germans have proposed it, but nobody else has taken it up. If we could, we ought to have been putting pressure on Turkey to prevent it from invading Syria. We ought to be able to put peacekeepers into northern Syria to protect civilians and to protect the ISIS camps. And we don't have either the capacity or the will to do this. But I think, you know, obviously there are people who'd like to create a classic army, but I don't think that's what's happening. I think if you study EU external security policy, it's much more, and this is where the left debate comes in, because the left sort of argued that all humanitarian intervention was militaristic. I think you can't use classic military means. I mean, you can't bomb, like in Kosovo, you can't bomb for human rights. But nevertheless, there are moments when I think you do need force to be able to protect civilians on the ground and to keep the peace. In Syria in the last year, there was something like 200 to 300 local ceasefires. If the international community had taken those ceasefires seriously and had been prepared to put... I know certain cases, actually, where civil society has said, please bring the Red Cross to our village and then we won't be attacked. And that's been done. That's the kind of thing I'm thinking about. And I think EU needs to have the capacity to do that, because we'll never be able to address issues like Syria or Libya.
So if I don't have another question here, maybe I could end on, because since Syria is really, I think, such a dystopian vision, both of the future but also of the present. But I think what we are seeing, as you very rightly pointed out, are a lot of protests in Iraq, in Sudan, and especially women in Sudan, in Lebanon, in Iran at the moment, of course, brutally repressed by the regime. But nevertheless, what we are not seeing is any international solidarity. And I think one of the elements we need to think about in the utopian vision and spaces of utopia would be, what could one do to build up these constituencies again, which were in the 70s, 80s, there was so much more of transnational solidarity.
Yes, it's a bit of a mystery to me, and particularly I was thinking when we were talking about the local. The local is, of course, the global. You know, in all these local areas and places like Syria, you know, these warlords are linked into global networks, whether they're smuggling networks, whether they're London property prices, whatever. So there's a lot of global networking going on, but what is weird is that the hopes that we had during the 1980s of transnational civil society have not played out. It's, you know, my job, I mean, my main research is on these kinds of conflicts. And I'm running a big conflict research program, and we're looking at Syria, Iraq, Somalia, South Sudan, and Congo. What is extraordinary is that in every field, it's not just civil society in terms of protesters, it's also that there are doctors keeping the health system going. You've probably heard about the white helmets in Syria. In South Sudan, there are these legal activists who are trying to get legal redress for property. You know, there are journalists trying to act like journalists that keep
Yemen, the entire health system in Yemen depends on either ICRC or the Médecins Sans Frontières.
Yeah. But there are local doctors too who who risk death every single day to keep their hospitals going. And yet they should be the ones that we're supporting. The international community tends to focus on the armed groups and reaching agreements instead of trying to expand the space where civicness exists. And that's partly a problem of lack of solidarity. And that's something I really puzzle about. I mean, there is solidarity from diaspora groups, say for Kashmir, but it doesn't seem to go beyond diaspora groups. And is it because we are so preoccupied with our internal problems in a way that we weren't in the 70s or 80s? I don't know. It's so weird because we're more interconnected than ever before. We know more about what goes on than ever before. Syria is the social media conflict. You can, you know, look at Facebook, there's citizen journalism, there's everything in Syria. You could analyze the whole thing through the social media, and yet why is it not producing the kind of solidarity that's absolutely necessary if we are to try and address these conflicts? It's a big question mark, and I'm afraid I don't have an answer.
So I don't think we should leave it at the moment with the question mark if I don't see any other hands up, unless we have answers from the audience. This may be the other possibility. But if we don't, I think we're going to...
European Utopias from below. Thank you very much, Mary Kaldor and Randeria Shalini. Sie dürfen applaudieren. Morgen, nachdem jetzt das eröffnet ist, der Debattenraum im utopischen Raum, morgen um 15 Uhr darf ich Sie wieder einladen. Da geht es um heimatlose Weltbürger und globale Bewegungsfreiheit. Nicolo Milanese und Andreas Cassé im Gespräch mit Ilya Trojanow. Dann um 18 Uhr Utopien in der Realpolitik, hier in unserem Stadtraum, in unserem Land, darüber hinaus auch ein bisschen. Birgit Hebein, Mireille Ngosto und Daniela Platsch, drei Frauen aus dem politischen Raum, im Gespräch mit Oliver Scheiber. Und dann um 20 Uhr etwas ganz Besonderes aus dem Kunst-Musikbereich, den Sortes Kohle, Konzert, utopische Klänge und dann ein Gespräch Lia Trojanow mit den Musikern von Sortes Kohle über utopische Klänge. Sie haben mit uns jetzt noch die Gelegenheit, hier im Odeon zu verweilen. Es gibt draußen den famosen Büchertisch. Sie können gerne auch mit allen, die hier mitwirken am Programm, im Raum draußen ins Gespräch kommen. Vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Wir hoffen, Sie auch morgen wieder begrüßen zu dürfen und wir hoffen, Sie sagen es auch weiter, wenn es Ihnen gefallen hat. Dankeschön, schönen Abend noch.